This lecture is on Chapter 6 on the media. First question, how did television change American politics? Well, there's a number of things I've listed here, and I'd like to go through them. First, it enabled candidates to bypass party organization to appeal directly to voters. Before television, you had political parties, or I should say political party organization, that really campaigned on behalf of the candidates, even all the way up to President of the United States. And the public really didn't see the candidate, know what they look like, or had an impression of them as a person. Really what they saw was the political parties and brochures and handouts and things of that nature. Oh, sure, there were pictures, but probably most people before television couldn't pick out the candidate if they were walking down the street. So when television came along, it enabled the candidate to pass up the party organization, no longer in need of all these hundreds and even thousands of people who went around in every city, for example, and campaign on behalf of all the candidates of the party. You didn't need that anymore. You could go directly on television, put in television ads, or appear on television news shows, and appeal directly to voters. Probably the best example I can think of is, and I always think when I talk about this subject, I always think about Mayor Jane Byrne in Chicago. Right after Mayor Daley died, this is the first Mayor Daley, there was sort of chaos in the machine. You had this huge Democratic Party organization. And so along comes this woman, Jane Byrne, who I think she was head of consumer affairs or something like that for the city. It was a pretty minor role. She was relatively unknown. The acting mayor right after Daley died was Bilandic, and he was involved in Chicago, where he was the mayor at the time, unelected mayor appointed at the time when there was this huge snowstorm. And what happened basically was that Mayor Byrne, she became mayor, went on television and did these ads saying that the city was really doing a tremendous disservice to the citizens by its effort to remove the snow. And she was actually doing commercial standing in the snow as it was falling, and said if she was elected, it would be much better. She would never make those kinds of mistakes again. So here she was in a place that had what was considered to be the best party organization in existence. Anybody who was endorsed by that organization would be sure to win. And she beat it. She beat the organization, and she beat it because of television and her ability to get on television and convince voters that they should vote for her. The second thing that happened with television is it made image, candidate appearance, and the candidate voice more important. In the beginning, when this was first analyzed by political scientists, there was a tendency to think that the only kind of people who would be candidates in the future would be beautiful people. But that was an exaggeration. But at the same time, still, candidate appearance, what I call image, candidate appearance and voice, where you have to look the part, is very important. And not only do you have to have an image that looks right, are you old enough, strong enough looking, sounding like you know what you're talking about, that sort of thing. That became key, and it's a very, very important thing, and probably a classic example of it. Maybe it was somewhat exaggerated, but if you go back to the first presidential debates, you had President Nixon, who was a Vice President Nixon then, and President Kennedy, who was Senator Kennedy at the time, running in 1960, and they appear in the first presidential debates, and President Kennedy looked much better, and he sounded much better. He sounded more confident, more articulate, able to cite statistics and information much faster than Nixon could. Nixon had a particular problem of looking like he was sweating when he appeared under the lights. Probably most of us would be sweating, but he looked really bad when he did it. And the end result was that Kennedy looked a lot better and sounded a lot better and sort of set the stage for what it would be like to be a candidate in this future of television. Kennedy won, so a lot of people attributed that appearance in the debates as the reason. I'm not so sure, but at least it pointed in the direction that candidates started to go for the rest of time, even up till now. Candidates are doing that, doing a lot of preparing for debates, and then attempting to sound like they know what they're talking about. Another thing is it gives advantage to the media savvy people. If you're really good on television, if you know how to project on television, you're going to do a lot better than candidates who can't. If you go back to candidates who were, a product of the old system before television, like say the first Mayor Daley, they weren't savvy about television. Really, probably the best candidate to ever come along who knew how to use television was President Reagan. Now, President Reagan was an actor, so he had a tremendous advantage over the typical politician. But he really knew how to project on television. Matter of fact, when he made television commercials for himself, he'd usually do it on one take, and it was in a live setting where he'd be in a grocery store or someplace like that, complaining about the price of things, because he was running against the previous Democratic environment. So anyway, you have to be politically savvy about it, or at least it really helps to be politically savvy about how to use the media. Go back and look at anything you can find about President Reagan. He was really good. On the other side, the best candidate I've ever seen on the Democratic side would be President Clinton. He was really good too at handling the media. Another thing is it changed the nature of campaign organization. Like I said, in the days before television, you had people going around passing out literature and talking about the candidates. But with television, you needed a new kind of campaign organization. You needed an organization that was able to use television. You needed people who were capable of putting commercials together. So what happens is that a number of people who had backgrounds in, say, product advertising on television then turned to candidates and began to represent candidates and provide that kind of thing. And it sort of left the political parties out to dry because they didn't have the skills in the new age. They didn't have the skills that were required by the candidates, and so the candidates had to go outside the traditional party organization in order to get the skills and expertise that they needed to win. And then the last thing is it helped to build a presidency-centered government. Now we'll be talking about this all the way through the class, but here's a good place to start. The way in which it did that was the president becomes way more important on television, through television. The president is way more important than Congress or the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court, which is never on television, is really left way behind. But Congress never really looks too good when they are on television because they're not the kind of organizational setup that speaks in one voice or doesn't look like they're in control or in charge. But the presidency is a different kind branch of government. It's one, but it's represented by one person. It speaks in one voice. It's actually quite perfect, I would say, for television. And so when things are going wrong, there's problems. People, because of the television age, look to the president as the person who's going to solve the problem. And that has a lot to do with the way the institution of the presidency and the branch of government is run compared to Congress, which would be the only real opposition or challenge to the president. Okay, second question, how does the government manipulate the media? Well, essentially when you're talking about government manipulation of the media, you're talking essentially about the president. And how does the president do that? Because again, we have a presidency-centered government. So I listed some things here. Let me go through them. Press releases and press briefings. One way to control the media is to control the kind of information that they get. That's a key thing. Control the information that's available to the press. Now really the best way for the press to find out what's really going on in the government is to do some investigative journalism. And that's almost never done anymore. It used to be done all the time, going back to such things as Watergate and the whole thing that came out of the Washington Post, Woodward and Bernstein, All the President's Men, even became a movie. So there's this whole process of how the media should operate, of not listening to what the government says, but actually observing what they're doing. But in an effort to avoid that, in an effort to try to make sure that that the media doesn't know what's going on behind closed doors, the government attempts to manipulate them. And one of the ways you can do that is press releases and press briefings. It makes their job really easy. Press releases, you write up what you want them to report in the newspaper or on television. And press briefings is where you invite them into the White House, for example, and you have a press secretary who meets with them every single day and answers their questions. So that's the way, that's a good way to kind of control them. They're given space in the White House. They're giving access to the press secretary, and they wind up reporting whatever the government tells them to report. Second thing is presidential interviews. Now, the president goes out every once in a while. You'll see President Obama going on 60 Minutes or some other television show. He's even been on Jon Stewart's show, The Daily Show. Well, why does the president do that? He does that because he's, number one, rewarding the journalists that are favorable toward him, and second of all, he's going to try to manipulate the media by giving interviews to people who we know are going to toss him questions that are pretty much what we call softball questions, easy to answer. He's not going on Fox News, where they would be much tougher on him and they would be yelling at him and all kinds of stuff like that. He avoids that. So when he gives an interview, like he goes on 60 Minutes, most of what he says is things that he wants them to report on, and that's exactly what they do. Another way in which the president attempts to control the media is through press conferences. Presidents appear much like the press secretary, where the audience is all press people, and they get to ask him questions. And so he calls on them, mostly if you notice, he calls on them by name. They're seated in a place where he knows where CBS is and NBC and so on. And he gets to call on whoever he wants, and there's not time to call on everybody. So he's going to make sure he calls on the people who are going to be more friendly toward him. And he attempts, in the process, usually, if they're tough questions, to one way or another avoid them. Okay, another way in which the president attempts to control the media is leaks to the media. A lot of times the government will leak information, whether it's coming out of an individual department like the Defense Department, where they'll talk about, say, during a war, how many of the enemy have been defeated, or whether leaders from the Taliban or ISIS or any other groups, Al Qaeda, whoever we're fighting, um, what they what they want the media to report about what's going on there. So in effect, the leaks are an attempt to get information. So it looks like the journalists figured it out for themselves, but in fact, they got it from the government. And then the last one is controlling the agenda or issues of the day. The president spends a lot of time talking to the media and talking to the public because he's trying to control the agenda, what they focus on. For one thing you'll notice, which has been glaring to me in the 8 years of the Obama administration, is that the agenda never includes big cities and what's going on in big cities and the problems of big cities, even though President Obama was supposedly a community organizer in Chicago, and so he would be very familiar as a community organizer of what the problems are, how many poor people there are, what their problems are, with the need for jobs in the communities of poor people, especially African American communities, but also other people of color, and that he would have placed on the agenda some things that could be done to help those people get out of poverty. But if you'll notice, the agenda almost never, actually never included any of that. So the president's controlling the agenda, but he's talking about the wars or something, Obamacare or something else that is near and dear to his heart, and avoiding a lot of other issues that need to be addressed. Okay, number 3 is, why is the media so important in a democracy? Well, there's a lot of reasons, and I listed some of them here. First of all, they're the only source of information for the public outside the government. So you can either listen to the government and what it's saying. One of the reasons, by the way, why public television is so awful in terms of its conservative approach to issues is that they oftentimes, more often than not, present the public officials whenever there's a problem or an issue coming before the American public. And so they give the view of the Secretary of State or Secretary of Defense or whoever it is. And the end result is, if you know anything about government, you know what they're going to say ahead of time. They've been briefed by the White House, and they have talking points, and they stick to those talking points. And the public learns little or nothing more than what they knew before. So if you're really going to do your job as media people, you have to, again, do investigative journalism and talk to people who are not in the government, but are knowledgeable about what's going on. That's why a program like Democracy Now! With Amy Goodman is way better than watching the traditional mainstream media, who tend to just kind of repeat what the government wants them to repeat. But check that out sometime. Democracy Now! You can find it on the internet with Amy Goodman, and you'll see a completely different approach to the issues, and different people, different kinds of people appearing, journalists, writers, academics, people like that who know what's going on, but who don't get a chance to voice those opinions on traditional media. The second thing is, the public's unable to make informed judgments unless they have the facts. The public's always going to remain in the dark if it's not for the media. Media is extremely important. You can't make informed judgments. You can't make meaningful judgments unless you know what's going on. And the only way you really know what's going on is through the media. That is the average public, because the public doesn't possess, as I say in the next point, the public does not possess the time or the capacity to evaluate what the government's doing. They just really, even educated people, don't have the time or the inclination to go ahead and try to figure it out for themselves. Go to the library or take classes or do something that's going to get them informed about the public, about the politics of what's going on. No, they rely on the media. Mostly it's television. And that's that's a problem in itself we'll talk about in a minute, but it's absolutely essential that the media provide them with the information they need. If they don't have it, the democracy's in real trouble. They're the only institution in politics that's protected by the law. That is, the media is the only institution. Political parties, interest groups, and so on are not protected. And they're the only ones who can really, the media is the only ones who really can investigate the government. They don't do it much anymore, largely because they don't have the staff. We don't have real journalists, permanent journalists like we used to. Mostly it's stringers, that kind of thing you'll see, and they really don't have time to do it, and they don't have the money to do it. So they don't do that kind of investigative journalism like they used to do in the past. I lived most of my adult life in Chicago, and the Tribune and the Sun-Times used to do a lot of investigative reporting. There was things like investigating how the city would handle bribes. And so what they did was they even set up, and this took a lot of money, they set up a tavern, and it was actually a front for the investigative journalists, and they saw how inspectors came in and other public officials like police and so on, trying to intimidate them and get bribes from them, and it was all kept on camera, and the end result was that they could then do an expose. You just really don't see those exposés anymore. And then the last thing I would say here about number 3 is if the media fails, it means that the public is ignorant. And really, that's kind of the direction we're in right now. Okay, the last one is, how does the media change in recent years? Well, there's a lot of things that you could mention here. Let me go through them. I even have more than one slide on this. It focuses on entertainment over hard news. Nowadays, there's a focus on celebrities, movie stars, TV actors, especially if they get in trouble or they're having problems, like they get DUIs. Could be other people, like I saw in the paper today an issue about ball players, like football players and baseball players, in terms of DUIs, and the National Football League has had issues dealing with a spousal and girlfriend abuse by players. So that kind of stuff, which I would consider to be infotainment or about celebrities, is way more likely to be in the news than anything about what's going on in foreign policy or domestic policy. Number 2 is a concern about ratings, that the media knows that if they talk about celebrities, that the ratings are going to go up. If they talk about issues like how to reform Social Security, the ratings are going to go down. So the focus is on how to get the ratings. And another thing is that you now have coverage 24/7. It started with CNN and Ted Turner putting a network together that was on all the time with news. 24/7 news, events, stories, personalities. And what happened is, not that so much that people, wow, nowadays people can really get a lot of information about what's going on in Afghanistan or what's going on in terms of Congress, in terms of what it's doing. Instead, you get this emphasis on entertainment, emphasis on celebrities, and then a 24/7 coverage of that kind of stuff. I guess the classic example would have been the OJ case, and how it just permeated the news for weeks and weeks and weeks, and just to the detriment of everything else, all the important political information. As a matter of fact, if you look at the studies that have been done about political coverage on television, um, it's about um, 1/10 of the coverage. It isn't even close to the kind of coverage that's given to everything else. As a matter of fact, the weather gets way more coverage than any political information. I live here in Santa Fe, and we don't have our own television station. We're too small for that. But we do watch television that's coming out of Albuquerque. And I swear they spend more time on the weather because they cover the whole state. It's a small state, so they cover everybody's weather in the state. And they spend way more time on that than anything else. It takes a major event happening, usually it has to do with the police shooting somebody in Albuquerque, that would get more coverage than the weather. So if you're looking for like what's going on in Santa Fe in terms of the capital, what's going on in the capital in terms of what the government's doing, um, you almost never get any of that in a half an hour news broadcast. Another thing, of course, is reduced staff. Back in the old days, you had major staffs of people in television news, but you don't have that anymore. Now you've got these stringers, you've got people, very few people covering the issues. Back in the 80s, there was an attempt to try to preserve the numbers of people that were working for newspapers and TV and radio in the news section, but that didn't survive. It's all about making money, and because it's all about making money, it results in part-time workers and all kinds of other reductions in the emphasis on the news that result in little or no information getting to the public. An emphasis on another one is the emphasis on Democrats and Republican consultants debating each other. For some reason, and I think it's mainly because it's entertaining to have two people arguing with each other, or at least two people arguing with each other on television news. You see this on CNN all the time. So that you've got a representative of the Democrats and representative Republicans, and they go at each other. And the problem with that is that it doesn't really present the issues, and it's just a defense of the Democrats and a defense of Republicans, and the public doesn't really get to learn much. And so the end result is kind of who won on the consultant level. And it's just more entertainment than it is real knowledge. I would say the same thing happens in presidential debates as well. It's more entertainment than it is informational. Also an emphasis on so-called experts, especially when we're fighting a war. We bring in these military experts, and again, you won't see that happen on Democracy Now!, but you see that on the traditional media. They have these so-called experts on the military. Usually they're ex-military people, and what they almost always do is when a war starts is they project a easy and early victory for the United States. On the face of it, it probably appears like that would be the case, given the fact that we're kind of in the bully position where we go after countries that really can't fight back, like Iraq and Afghanistan. So these experts, these so-called experts, I really have to emphasize so-called experts, are not really experts at all, and they're almost always wrong. If you go back and you look at it, and look at the projections and what they say. As a matter of fact, if you look at almost any experts, they're wrong. They're not able to project what's going on. I guess my classic example that I would use of experts is we hired hundreds, maybe even thousands of people during the Cold War to analyze what was going on in Russia, because they were our main Cold War enemy. Every speech, everything they did was analyzed. And yet, with all these thousands of experts, none of them predicted the downfall of the Soviet Union. Not even a single one. So experts, just take that as with a grain of salt. Okay, we've moved away from Edward R. Murrow, Walter Cronkite, to the beautiful people with sex appeal rather than journalistic backgrounds. That's a key element of television. is because of ratings. You want if people can't get ratings after a short period of time, the people reading the news, presenting the news, if they can't get ratings that are high, they get kicked out. And you don't have people with real backgrounds. There's very few that are real journalists. The people like Edward R. Murrow and Walter Cronkite, probably most of the people listening to me now, probably don't even know who these people are. But go look them up. Look up some YouTube videos of Edward R. Murrow or Walter Cronkite. These guys had a long history of working for newspapers before they ever went on television. And believe me, they were not beautiful people. They didn't have any of the so-called sex appeal of people you got now who don't know what they're talking about. Okay, here's a few more. Here's a change, another change, part 4, question 4, I should say. Satire is now being competitive with the traditional news outlets. So you got people like Jon Stewart, who are on The Daily Show, which more young people watch than they watch traditional media, and they're learning more about the news from him and his satire approach than they are with from traditional news outlets. In some ways, that's okay, because a lot of times Jon Stewart has been very good, and he nails it right on the head, and it's entertaining at the same time. As a matter of fact, there are studies that have shown that young people who watch The Daily Show know more than people who watch traditional, people same age, who watch traditional media. So that's becoming a big part of how people get their news nowadays, or at least young people. Decline in newspapers is another thing. Newspapers are going out of business. It isn't just the internet made the traditional paper in your hands kind of thing obsolete, but the fact that people stop reading the newspapers. And I really think that's a really tremendous disservice, because if people are going to get their news from television rather than the newspapers, they're not going to learn as much. And also, television is a media that is very what Marshall McLuhan called the hot media. That is, there's a tendency to have a very emotional content to almost every story that goes on. So if there's murders or other kinds of horrific things that are done, a woman drowns her baby or something like that, when people read it on or watch it on television, it's way more dramatic, way more emotional than if they just read about it in the paper. And a lot of people say, I don't pay attention to the news because it's so, it just depresses you. It's very depressing. So if you read the paper, you're reading the paper, the paper is an easier way to handle these same stories. You can get the same information without that emotional content. And especially if you read papers that don't try to sensationalize. Most of the good papers don't do that, the Tribune and so on. But the Christian Science Monitor is probably the best one. Christian Science Monitor, read that one if you're bothered by the news. It doesn't sensationalize anything. And then the last thing I would say is the decline of public reading news over watching TV. So I guess I've talked about that already, that if people don't read the news, they just watch TV, they're not going to get nearly as much information. As a matter of fact, studies show that the amount of information you get in a half an hour television show on news is about the same as you get in a front page of a newspaper. So it's not very good. Newspapers are in decline now, and it's harder and harder to find good journalists. But yeah, let me just say that the best way to get your information is the newspaper.